Welcome, everyone. This is Mark Leclerc from Farm Radio International. I'm the head of knowledge management and communications at Farm Radio, and I just wanted to walk you through an introduction to our presentation, ICT for Scale, a roadmap to scale up. Just for some background, we originally did this presentation as a live event and webinar, and it went fairly well, but we did have some technical difficulties with some of the audio and video that day. As well, our Malawi colleagues, who I'll introduce in a second, were only around for about half of that. So we decided to re-record our presentation just so people can get the information. And this is what this recording is. But we will be answering questions that were presented that day in the room that we did the presentation in, as well as on the webinar. So hopefully that is enlightening, and we're answering actually a few more questions than we originally answered. Just a little bit of background on the research. This is a joint research project done by ourselves, Farm Radio International, and Farm Radio Trust in Malawi. It was funded by IDRC, the International Development Research Center, and it's a 30-month research initiative that we did that's really trying to understand how can we scale up agricultural solutions that are promising. So really focusing on the agricultural solutions themselves and how ICTs can play a role in the scale-up process. Hopefully we can come up with some good answers for you today and start the conversation on ICT for scale. We're going to bring forward some of our main findings informed by our experience on many different development projects around the world that we looked into in our meta review and case study work on this project. We're also going to bring forward some real world experience from our research team in Malawi from Farm Radio Trust. But we're also going to try to bring forward some practical advice on how you as a practitioner or as a policymaker can think about scaling up in your projects and initiatives to try to achieve better results or better outcomes in those projects. So we're trying to keep this as a conversation. This is the first of many webinars to come that we'll be sending out invites to in the future. So we really want you to engage on this and show up to the next one and ask questions, and perhaps we can even feature you in future webinars. I'm just going to introduce our speakers today. So we have Dr. Bernard Pelletier, the lead researcher on the project and who is from Farm Radio International. We have Berhani Gebru, who is the director of programs from FHI 360's Tech Lab. We have Alubi Kenyenda from Farm Radio Trust. She's their agricultural innovation systems specialist. She'll also go into some of the gender dimensions of the intervention research that we did in Malawi. Lastly, we have George Velili, who is the CEO of Farm Radio Trust in Malawi. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Bernard Pelletier, who will start some of the introduction into some of the frameworks that we're looking at in this particular research.
Hello, I'm Bernard Pelletier, Knowledge Management Team Lead at Farm Radio International. I'm part of the research team implementing this initiative. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll give a brief introduction to the ICT for Scale project. Let's first look at the broader international context within which this initiative is taking place. In particular, we want to highlight the fact that the idea of achieving impact at scale is seen as one of the key challenges facing the international development community. As an example, we can refer to the most recent FAO report on the state of food and nutrition security in the world, which highlights that world hunger has now been on the rise for a number of years, despite considerable efforts and resources invested by national governments and the international community. To address this issue and other global issues affecting the world's most vulnerable population, the Sustainable Development Goals have been put forward with the purpose of achieving impact at scales on issues such as food security, education, health, gender equality, climate change, and so on. In 2018, the G7 identified the need to identify scalable solutions for development impact. Within that broader context, recent years have seen an increased interest in the study and development of frameworks to inform the scaling of agricultural innovation. Now, many definitions have been proposed for the concept of scaling. Here we will use the following definition, where scaling is viewed as expanding, replicating, adapting, and sustaining successful policies, programs, or projects in geographic space and over time to reach a greater number of rural poor. Furthermore, we could look at scaling through a number of dimensions. First, we have the idea of scaling out, also called horizontal scaling, which is the process of expanding impact of an innovation through replication, dissemination, extension. This is often how people first conceptualize the idea of scaling. Second, we can talk about scaling up or vertical scaling, which refers to the changes in policy or institutions needed to support the scaling of an innovation. Finally, the concept of scaling deep has been proposed, referring to the transformation of social, cultural norms and practices and attitude through awareness raising and capacity building, which may be required to support the systemic changes needed to facilitate the scaling of an innovation. Following this increased interest in the concept of scaling, ICTs have been described as having an important role to play in achieving impact at scale. To illustrate this, we have taken a quote from a recent report by Erickson and the Earth Institute of Columbia University, which is as follows. ICT has immense potential to speed up and scale a very wide range of cutting-edge technologies, applications, and platforms across the economy, helping low-income countries to leapfrog to achieve key development milestones while contributing to a growth economy. It can also dramatically reduce the cost of service delivery. Furthermore, it is worthwhile to indicate that ICT are included explicitly in a number of targets from the Sustainable Development Goals. Part of the rationale for seeing ICTs as contributors to achieving impact at scale is simply explained by the potential reach of ICTs among the most vulnerable populations. As we can see here, the increased penetration of mobile phones even in sub-Saharan Africa, illustrate here that potential of reaching a large number of the vulnerable populations in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, if we consider also radio as an ICT in its own, we can see from that second image here that we can reach quite a number of people through the radio here. Here we illustrate a number of stations that have been affiliated with or worked with Farm Radio International and Farm Radio Trust here. And we can see that there's a potential here to reach quite a number of people. So part of the rationale for using ICTs to in the context of scaling is simply associated with this idea of reaching more people. Also, there is, in addition to the penetration of mobile phones and reaching millions of people through radio, ICT can play a role in strengthening interaction, linkages, and networking amongst key stakeholders, which can play an important role in also strengthening systems and changing systems in terms of being able to make the changes needed to scaling new innovations. Also, there's also the typical role of ICTs in playing a role in increased access to timely and relevant agricultural information, financial services, and input or output markets. There is, however, some gap. There are some gaps, however, in the ability of ICTs to enhance the scaling process. And this is why this project was put in place, to try to fill some of these gaps and have a better understanding of the potential role of ICTs in the process of scaling. More specifically, the research questions that informed these initiatives are as follows. First, we were interested to identify what combination of ICTs, actors, and institutional arrangements were most effective in scaling agricultural solutions. Then we wanted to explicitly address issues related to gender equality in the context of scaling. Finally, we wanted to identify the various barriers that may limit the reach or effectiveness of ICTs in scaling initiatives. Just a note, finally, to highlight that the focus of the research was put on the use of ICT as tools to scaling any agricultural solution. Throughout the implementation of this initiative, when we mention ICT for scale, people often interpret it as the scaling of ICT-based solution or innovation. Although this is certainly of interest to this research initiative, we wanted to look at it more broadly and include the scaling of any agricultural innovation. So some of the research activities that were conducted, in addition to the usual literature review that was done of scholarly papers and the gray literature, is first a meta-review of about 15 projects that have used ICTs in the context of scaling. So we've used it in using a content analysis of project documents and also interviews of project implementers. We also went a bit deeper on 4 specific case studies for projects taking place in Malawi, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Ghana, where we also conducted some interviews and also did some analysis of different project documents. We had what we call an intervention research, which was to test specific elements of our ICT for scale model in a concrete initiative that took place in Malawi around the scaling of soybean inoculants. So that allowed us to test specific elements of that model and kind of further our understanding of some of the issues faced when trying to scale up agricultural innovations. And finally, this is the last point here about the learning platform, is to highlight the fact that we wanted this to be a discussion, a dialogue among development practitioners interested in the scaling using ICTs. So, so the learning platform has been to involve a number of stakeholders, practitioners, researchers in the process of sharing ideas and have a bit of a co-creation of knowledge around these issues here. So this webinar here is one activity that is part of that learning platform. So I will now let Berhane present some of the findings for the meta review in the case studies. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to do this presentation. My name is Berhane Gobru. I work for FHI 360, and we are also an IDRC grantee for quite some time. I provided some inputs to the team on the case study. Dr. Helena Shilomboleni, who did the meta review, is attending the webinar online, and she will be able to answer some of your questions at the end. Next slide. So the study involved 15 projects for meta review and 4 interventions for the case study, which were selected from a pool of 196 projects in agriculture, food and nutrition security, selected based on published journals and grey literature. And from the pool of 196 projects, 71 were shortlisted based on inclusion and exclusion criteria, which was set by the research team. And the meta review, the 15 projects selected for meta review, were selected on inclusion and exclusion criteria, which included the interventionists must have a focus on smallholder producers. They should use multiple and different combinations of ICTs. They should have an explicit scaling objective, and they should have, some documents, whether in the grey literature or published for reviewing, and the relative importance of gender considerations provided by the initiatives. And the 4 projects for the case study were selected, those projects that intensely manifest the use of ICTs in their program, in addition to having an explicit mention of scaling objective. Next slide. So the meta review, in terms of the geographic representation of the selected projects, the focus was primarily on sub-Saharan Africa for multiple reasons, primarily for convenience. Most of farm radio programs and IDRC programs are in that area. But some projects were also included from Asia and South America. The projects selected for the meta review spanned 15 countries, and 8 of these were in Africa, 4 were in Asia, and 3 were in South America. Next slide. For the case study, the 4 projects selected for the study used a combination of ICT tools for increasing access to extension services. That I have indicated it on the middle column of the slide. Delivery of climate and improved agricultural advisories, market information and financial services. And 3 of the projects primarily focused on knowledge sharing using ICT to amplify scale up. So that was, knowledge sharing was the primary pathway that was used by the 3 projects. But they also have some policy pathway, which included informing the policymakers to make policy changes so that the use of ICTs can be funded by government programs. But one of the cases, which is ISOCO, or the Digital Farmer Services of ISOCO in Ghana, used market-based approach for delivering its services by working with outgrowers. So the outgrowers are a kind of contract farming providers. The outgrowers themselves are farmers, but they have enough capital to engage a bunch of farmers, say 30 or 40 farmers. They would have an agreement with the farmers to grow specific types of crops, and the outgrowers would provide them, would work with bank to get loan on behalf of the farmers, and after getting loans, they will buy the necessary inputs provided to the farmers, and the farmers' commitment would be to follow the guidelines provided by the outgrowers, and then during harvest pay it back to the outgrowers in kind. And then so the ISOCO Digital Farmer Service, what they do is they provide market information to the farmers who have contract with the outgrowers. They also provide them information, agricultural information, especially on climate smart agriculture. So at the end, ISOCO would be paid for their services from the outgrowers. So it's quite a successful model, and also quite a sustainable model in Ghana. And in terms of the scale of operation, or the scale of operation of those services for ISOCO, they are reaching over 1 million farmers in Ghana. They also have franchises in other countries, such as in Kenya, in Uganda, Cameroon, and other countries. In Malawi, which is the first project listed, they're reaching about 700,000 farmers. The Chai project in Uganda, which I am also involved in its implementation, 250,000 farmers are reached, and in Ethiopia, 750,000 farmers are reached. So the scale of operation of the cases that are selected is quite significant. Next slide. So the combinations of ICTs that have been used by the 4 cases selected for case study, but also very similar for the 15 projects selected for meta review, included the use of SMS or USSD for sending messages, automated voice calls, voice messages, interactive voice response, interactive radio, which is a radio program championed by Farm Radio International, where the use of IVR is integrated with the use of radio to facilitate interactivity, and also call centers. So in terms of the type of communication, all cases used push SMS to send agricultural information to farmers and extension workers. They also used the pull approach, or on demand, where a short code or long codes have been used by farmers to access information on demand. And this method was primarily used for market information. And also there was an interactive approach, especially by the projects in Malawi, Uganda, and in Ethiopia, where interactive radio broadcasters for the dissemination of agricultural information was used. There was also kind of transactional method of communication used by ISOCO for mobile money services and virtual marketplace platform. So the virtual marketplace platform used by ISOCO was to facilitate the sale of agricultural produce, the output, and also the inputs for agriculture. They were connecting, it's a virtual platform for connecting the buyers and the sellers. Next slide. Next slide again. So in this slide, the role of ICTs in scaling up agricultural solutions. So there are there are 3 primary roles of ICTs in scaling up agricultural solutions. One is improving adoption of agricultural solutions. adoption would be improved because of improved access to information on the solution that the farmers would have access to, and it will increase the ability of farmers to apply the solution into action, and it would enhance the income generating potential of the farmers as a result of applying that into action. And the second is avoiding dilution of content, and the third is enhancing the inclusion of women. So the agricultural solutions that is being scaled up may not be novel or new, but it could be new to the farmers to whom the solution is being introduced, and the factors that affect the scale up and adoption of that agricultural solutions are the three factors that I have mentioned, and we will briefly go through each one of those three options, those three roles. Next slide. So this chart, which is on the role of ICTs for improving adoption of agricultural solutions, on the left side, we have the users at the beginning of the flow chart. So that some of the project started with the needs assessment of the users to understand the information and communication needs and challenges of the farmers, and how the drivers, which are at the top of the slide, such as infrastructure, policy support, institutions, and partnerships, affect the delivery and use of information. And then some of the projects made selection of the ICT tools, which is the first block on the chart, based on needs assessment. But for some of the cases, selection of the ICT tools was not informed by the needs assessment, but rather based on what technology competencies which they have, which it should not be, but some of them practice it that way. And the ICT-mediated services shared with farmers using ICT tools include, on the second block of the chart, which includes climate and weather information, farmer advisory services, market information, agricultural advisories, mobile money, farmer training, ICT-mediated farmer training, virtual marketplaces, micro-insurance, and digital farmer profile. So, together with the enabling environments that are indicated at the top of the chart, many of the projects showed evidence that the delivery of information led to improved access to information, increasing the knowledge of farmers on how to use the solution and apply the solution into action. So in terms of improving benefit, access to markets is a key factor that affects farmers' ability to sell their surplus production profitably. So but there is information gap between the farmers and the traders. The traders have more information about the price of goods, agricultural products. So bridging this information asymmetry between the farmers and traders was crucial to improve farmers' income from the sale of their surplus production, and then keep on adopting, maintain the adoption of that solution. And I have indicated inclusive adoption at scale. It's inclusive because it provided more access to women farmers as well, and at scale, as I said, the scale of operation is quite high, for some of them over 1 million, but it ranges between 250,000 up to over 1 million. And the feedback loop indicated in purple arrows, and continuously updating selection of ICT tools and contents. This was practiced by some of the cases or initiative projects, and it increased the credibility and usefulness of the disseminated information. So the project demonstrated the achievement of significant adoption. For example, in Malawi, 82% of the farmers with access to ICT mediated services adopted the promoted practices compared to 66% at baseline. In Uganda, 83% of the farmers adopted compared to about 58% at control sites. In Ethiopia, 40% of the farmers adopted biofertilizer, which was a promoted practice, compared to 12% for farmers who do not have access. So next slide. So here are the last two roles of ICT for supporting scale-up of agricultural solutions. So enhanced inclusion of women. It enables the dissemination of information tailored for women's needs, which was also informed based on the regular assessments, women's need assessments that was done and the feedback. But the limited ownership of technology among women was a major impediment to the inclusion of women. So to overcome this problem, some of the projects provided radio that was used by women farmers groups as a listeners group, so that they would be able to listen to programs pertinent to farming practices as a group. And some of the projects also provided smartphones to women so that they would be able to access information on mobile phones. There were also women-only call-in lines, especially in Malawi, where there was a dedicated line for women to call, because sometimes the calls could be clogged by more men callers. And engaging women in radio programs was also important, because that would, which was practiced by some of the projects, because obviously women would listen more when women farmers are talking on radio programs. The last one is avoiding the dilution of content. In the traditional approach, the way it's done is there are research institutions that would generate evidence-based agricultural practices, and they prepare manuals, and then they train the extension service delivery department, and then the extension service delivery department would train trainers at different levels, and then it will go down. By the time it reaches the farmers, some of the information is diluted already. So by the consistency in messages exchanged between research institutions, extension agents, and farmers is improved through the use of the technology, because the same information is disseminated to all. Next slide. So these are the key findings. One is the use of ICTs can enhance agricultural extension by reaching farmers, facilitating their participation, and improving adoption, which is something which I have indicated in the previous slides. So it can enhance, but it should be noticed that ICT alone cannot do those enhancements. It should be together with other enabling factors, like there should be a conducive policy environment, there should be an infrastructure that supports the ICTs, and so on. The second is the use of multiple ICT-based communication channels expands the reach and use of promoted solutions. However, it's also important to note that, for example, the push of generic SMS messages may not necessarily account for the complexity of the situations faced by smallholder farmers. So an SMS could be best suited, for example, for the delivery of market information. The price of maize is this much at this market outlet. So the information asymmetries that I previously mentioned, the traders have more information, the farmer would be able to show, no, I have this evidence, so that they would be able to negotiate for a better price. And in some instances, radio is more important when it's integrated with interactive voice responses, making phone calls, sending SMS, using social media, so that there is an interactivity between the farmers, and then more in-depth discussions can be made. And the third is disseminate hyper-local evidence-based agricultural practices. So the dissemination of highly localized in the local language, which is pertinent to the agroecological zoning of that area, is extremely important. Generating such content is requires a lot of effort, it requires a lot of coordination, it requires a skill at different levels. But some of the cases, some of the projects in this study made a deliberate effort to train the lower level Department of Agriculture personnel to understand weather forecasts, to understand agricultural advisories, and localize them for their setting, package them in the local language, and make them ready for dissemination. Next is establish effective multi-stakeholder partnerships. I mean, this goes without saying, but the most important lesson is that it takes time. Building partnerships takes time, and projects need to take into consideration to factor in that time. Next is strengthening and using existing local institutions. Make sure that it's embedded in existing structures, not create parallel structures. So the most successful projects in terms of sustainability are the ones that are embedded with government institutions that is responsible for providing the services after the project phase out. Next is the use of ICT increases demand for promoted agricultural solution. This is also extremely important. When we use ICT tools for promoting improved agronomic practices, we are reaching out a huge number of people which would not have been accessible through the regular extension system. So we are creating demand for the promoted agricultural practice. But the supply chain system in the country may not be able to support that. If you are promoting, for example, the farmers to plant a specific type of crop, if the supply chain system is not able to cope with the demand, that is a problem. So that needs to be factored in. And finally, better access to ICT is necessary to achieve women's empowerment, but it's not sufficient. Most of the projects that were studied did not challenge the status quo, did not challenge the status quo that is needed to address the disparities between and women. The social norms and the underlying inequalities were not challenged. Most of the projects assumed that, or their role was primarily to provide access, but what happens after that? For example, sharing the benefits from the increased production, it is still men. That was not challenged. So that needs to be taken into consideration. Next slide. This is my last slide. The barriers that limit the use of ICTs for scaling up agricultural solutions. One is limited availability of localized content. Most of the content is at national level, regional level, but the farmers would need highly localized content that's not available. And the second is the available content also is primarily masculine. What I mean by this is that when training manuals are prepared in languages where you for a woman and you for a man are different, the way it's referred is you need to do this is it refers to the man. So content is masculine, and there needs to be a deliberate effort to make it gender neutral. I think that is important, and that was a barrier. Next is SMS broadcasts are expensive. There was a total cost of ownership study that was done in Uganda, which was one of the cases for the CHAI project. And it showed that the use of ICT for dissemination, about 88% of the cost goes to SMS. About 4%, only 4% goes to radio. So if the cost of SMS is reduced, the ability to disseminate information would be tremendously increased. On the health sector, there is, for the use of USSD, some countries have zero-rated USSD broadcast, so something like that for agriculture needs to be done. Next is lack of mechanism for standardizing content that is disseminated to farmers. This is especially true where extension services are privatized. So any institution can come up with their content and then disseminate it to farmers. But that is not vetted, mandated, tested by by the research institutions. So there should be a mechanism for standardizing content without limiting, we should not be limiting innovation, but should also be standardized. Poor supply chain support promoted practices, as I previously said. Demand is increased, but the supply chain system is not ready to supply the needed inputs. Poor infrastructure, there is good penetration on mobile phone coverage, but still the poor farmers do not have access. Significant proportion of them do not have access to it. Smallholder farmers, especially women, limited access to technology in terms of, mobile phone ownership. In the low to middle income countries globally, women are 10% of women are less likely to have to own a mobile phone. So there is that disparity. Next is project focus on increasing information access to women and less on challenging the status quo. This is things that, an issue that I have already described. Low willingness to pay in cash for agricultural information. This is a pervasive problem. Again, in one of the projects in Uganda with the child project, only 35% of the households were willing to pay for agricultural information in cash. But as the experience shows in Ghana, in Isoko, farmers are more willing to pay if it is in kind, if they are paying in kind. And finally, funding agencies' preference for short-term or medium-term funding. But when we are talking about scale-up, especially if you want to use, actually it's all pathways, whether you are using information sharing pathway or policy pathway, you need time, and project durations need to be longer. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elube Kanyenda. I work at Farm Radio Trust as an Agriculture Innovation System Specialist. And in the implementation of the intervention research, I was the coordinator for the activities. Okay, so basically the intervention research was trying to test and refine, validate every findings of the meta research, case studies, and literature review. So basically, we were looking at the scaling of soybean inoculant. Why we chose inoculant? It's because it addresses practical needs of farmers. It's a low-cost technology. It was implementable within the season, that is 2018 and 2019. And then measurable, seasonal crop-based solution, and has supporting systems and institutions and infrastructure in terms of the producers, the suppliers, and the distributors, and had a gender dimension. So basically, the ICT tools that were used in the scale-up of soybean inoculant were participatory radio programs, the call center, also known as the Mlimi Hotline, SMS push and pull messages, social media, especially the WhatsApp. The participatory radio programs were done with Mudwatu community radio station in Mchinji on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. and a repeat on Saturdays at 4:10. So basically the content for the campaign was generated through the National Agriculture Content Development Committee. We had a baseline study or survey and also rapid assessment that informed the radio programs, what should go into the radio programs of the intervention research. So the NACTEC had representation of different players from the government and government organization and also the private sector, especially those dealing with soybean inoculant, because you don't want to promote a technology without engagement of the producers, as it may result in increase in demand, and then if you don't manage the supply side, then that becomes a problem. So the key messages that were broadcasted on the radio were on benefits, access, storage, and utilization of soybean inoculant and crop stand of inoculated soybean, because we took the value chain approach in the implementation of the project, looking at from production up to the harvest of soybean and marketing, and also soy crop management management practices in the field, including post-harvest preparation and marketing. So those were the messages that were mainly aired on the radio programs. We were also trying to assessing the number of farmers who are actually listening to the program. So we normally tell the farmers to say, when you're listening to the program, beep this number. We give them a number that informs us of the farmers who are actually listening to the radio program. So in March, we did a test. So we pushed a message to the farmers, informing them of the next radio program, the time of airing, a place of recording, and the topics to be covered. And then we had more people listening to the radio programs or beeping during the radio program that they're actually tuned in and they're listening, which actually informs us that during the implementation part of the intervention research, we had, yes, in some other months, like you can see from the graph, in December, there were more listeners. In January and February, our numbers were going down. So we had, okay, let's try a certain approach. Let's push a message to inform the farmers of the product. And we had more farmers beeping during this program. So more or less like a lesson learned on this one is that farmers, when you're starting a new agriculture program, they're not regular. You don't get regular listeners right away. So it needs a lot of reminders of the program. We had those put in place, but this was just like taking an affirmative step in ensuring that more farmers were listening. So this was how we're trying to assess the number of farmers who are actually listening to the radio program, apart from other means. So like I said, that we used different approaches. Like I talked about the radio, and now we have the Mlimi hotline. As you can see from the graph, it's just showing the interaction of the ICT platforms that we used. We have the call center. So the call center is provided by Farm Radio Trust through e-agents, or we call them extension agents, that provide advisories to farmers on toll-free lines on Airtel and TNM. So the farmers were informed of these toll-free lines so that they can access information on soybean inoculant. From the queries that the farmers ask, or from the frequently asked questions, they would also inform the radio programs on the content of the radio programs. For instance, if more farmers were asking about where to get inoculant, then on the next program would actually specify that so that we can answer some of those queries to the other masses that actually do not use the call center to get the advisories. Similarly, on our SMS push platform that I will talk about, we also push messages that also informed part of from the responses we get from our pool that also informed content from the radio program. And we have a memorandum of understanding with government in the provision of extension in collaboration and coordination. So with them, we escalate calls for those that we are unable to respond, and they give feedback to the farmers, which we have managed to build that good relationship. And then this also more or less like binds our relationship with the government, ensuring that whatever we're giving to the farmer is also coordinated and it's in harmony with what already exists on the ground or with the policies in the country. So the next graph that I'm going to show you is just showing you the cases we had in December by topic of the questions that we're actually getting from the call center. So you can see that in December we had more queries on inoculant among the other value chains, because like I said, the call center provide advisories on different value chains from livestock to crops. And then going down on the specific cases that we got on inoculant, we see that most of the farmers were inquiring about access and utilization, agronomic aspects of inoculated soybean, benefits of inoculant, information on inoculant, price of inoculant, storage, and other questions. And you can see from the graph there that you have females. This graph is demarcated by sex. You see that more females were just inquired a lot on access and utilization and agronomic aspects, but you have less of them asking about the benefits of inoculant. It's more of the men. I will come back on how we brought about affirmative actions that actually enhanced women to utilize these ICT platforms. But this is just echoing on the number of farmers who actually have mobile phones in the country, that they're less, and also those that actually use their phones to access agricultural information, they're also quite less. In terms of the SMS push platform that I talked about, we also had, we sent out about 21 messages to 2,317 farmers from November to December. Key messages on access, storage, utilization of inoculant, crop husbandry practices of inoculant soybean harvesting, gender, and airing times. And incoming SMSs we got from the farmers were on access, utilization, storage, market, appreciation, and appreciation of the program. So you can see that the Mlimi hotline is a free line. It's a toll-free line. But the SMS push, the messages we push, those are covered by Farm Radio Trust. But the messages coming to us are covered by the farmer. So the numbers you're seeing there are just showing the number of farmers who are actually willing to pay for an ICT service to seek advisories. So I'll bring to your attention on May. You see that we had a lot of April and May, especially. From March, April to May, you will see that we had a lot of farmers sending us messages. And most of these messages were on marketing of soybean inoculant. So at least we know that that is something that is more important to the farmers for them to actually get information on this. And in December, you see that we also had more farmers pushing messages to us or sending us messages. And mostly it was to do on access, where they can get the inoculant. So we see that farmers are willing to pay for an innovation, provided gives them like a tangible solution. So this time around, they were seeking certain information that they needed, the markets and also where to access soybean inoculant. And in terms of the numbers of farmers reached during the by our ICTs that we used, we see that participatory radio programs were reaching to approximately 235,000 farmers in Mchinji alone. And then the call center or the Mlimi hotline, we had about 259 cases on soybean inoculant. And on the SMS push, we pushed about 2,000 to 2,317 farmers. So basically, those are the numbers that were able to access some of the messages we had on the call center. There was an impact on the promotions that we made from the service that we've done, the analysis and whatnot. We see that at least in our findings, we see that there was an increase in inoculant sold by agro-dealers in Mchinji. So I'm giving you this, the slide that you're seeing here is just giving a comparison of the soybean that was sold in 2018 to 2019, this current season. So you see that last year, about 41,000 packets were sold. And this year we have about 87,000 packets sold. And this excludes distribution by NGOs and other donors who provide inoculant for free. But I must say at this point that this is not just the attribution of the campaign itself or the radio programs, but also existence of other players and institutions who provide demonstrations on use and benefit of inoculant, loan on credits on inoculant, free inoculant distribution, and also more or less like providing advisories also on inoculant. We have government staff on the ground and whatnot. So it's more or less like contribution to the increase in use of inoculant. We also see that majority of the farmers get information on inoculant on like access or sources of information on inoculant. We see that majority of the farmers were getting information on inoculant from radio, about 49.5%. And this was followed by extension workers, which is 31.9%. So very few farmers get information on inoculant from the mobile phones, but we see that from the radio, we had more numbers. So however, only 38% on radio. Of course, access is higher in terms of radio because ownership might be to a few individuals, but access may be to many. So about access, it's around 69%. And 41.9% on mobile phone, but 68% have access to a phone. And high ratio of farmer to extension worker, which is like why we're seeing for more farmers using the ICT platforms to get extension advisories. So in essence, access to information on inoculant is still a challenge. Availability of inoculant from our studies, we also saw that it was also a challenge. So in essence, we see that that could help us at least attribute to what actually the radio program did, because there were a lot of people accessing inoculant information through the radio and of course also the work of other extension workers on the ground. And these figures apply to the general population from the studies we did from Mchinji. So in terms of the barriers that we noticed from the implementation of the intervention research, it was cost of ICTs or willingness to pay. Like I demonstrated in my previous slide, only a few were able to send SMSs to us. The call center, yes, people called because it's a toll-free line, but then cost of ICTs is still very expensive. And we have other gender barriers, such as gender-related barriers, such as low ownership of ICTs. You see that more females don't own these ICTs, cultural barriers, more women and household cultural barriers. More women are busy most of the times with production work than listening to ICTs or using ICTs compared to men. So based on their roles that is deemed by society in which they're living, they tend to do that. They tend to do the production work a lot other than getting information. And also we see that household expenditure on ICTs, most of the priority when it comes to a household expenditure, I do not go to let's buy this, my wife or the mother of the household, a mobile phone, but it will go on other aspects. So aligning those expenditure decisions on a household tends to limit women in accessing these ICTs, or it's like a barrier. In infrastructure issues, from a previous slide, you see that some of the farmers were not listening to the radio programs, and we noticed that these were also due to issues of blackouts, frequent blackouts that we had, and issues of signal in some other areas of the radio station that we were using. So basically, infrastructure issues were also among the challenges that we had in the technological know-how on the use of ICTs. For instance, most people just assume that it's very difficult to manage a phone, specifically a smartphone. They don't want to learn about it. It seems very difficult. So it's just like they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to tune in into a radio program based on the frequency that works in that particular area. So those are among the barriers. However, there are some gender considerations that we put in place to ensure that we are enhancing women participation in the program. So, for instance, we had targeted radio programs, women's only call inlines, use of women groups in the programming to air all their issues, and also debate on specific gender issues so that they can talk about it, share their experiences. And also other strategies we had in place was time of airing, whereby we're considering that it is time whereby most women can actually listen to the radio, and also a combination of different ICT platforms, for instance, using radio that can encompass those people who cannot read, or mobile phones, and then SMS push, which can encompass those that actually can read. But so more or less like giving them a variety of choices from which they can listen to regardless of their literacy level so that they are covered. And also women participation in the program, and also we learned that even men involvement in the program. We noticed that involvement of both parties helps to support. They will support each other. If men understand why that is happening, they tend to support. But if you say crude to say women alone in our initiatives and whatnot, they tend to hinder the work because the men will not fully support that unless they understand that. So all those were put into consideration, and use of listening clubs or ICT hubs for targeted radio listening to bring in discussion on the technology that is inoculant and mainstreaming of gender on the radio programming, such as gender roles, equal distribution of farming resources and labor, etc. And also a WhatsApp group. So I want to bring to attention on the WhatsApp group. Ideally, it was to motivate the people so that they can use the WhatsApp group. It's very easy to give advisories through images and whatnot, and WhatsApp allows you to do that. So we tried to demonstrate on how they can actually use a WhatsApp, and we saw that a lot of women, they were actually more motivated to use the WhatsApp group or the WhatsApp app to use for communication. So we saw that distribution of smartphones can enhance the engagement, but then that brings about issues of sustainability, because in a previous program we did, or project we did, we distributed smartphones. They were working, so while women were actually involved, they were demonstrating how to use it, but then the issues of sustainability were not considered. So yes, distribution of smartphones can help enhance their participation in this, but then we also have to consider issues of sustainability. So from the intervention research, some of the key lessons we learned is that ICTs work best in combination. So to complement each other, for instance, radio programs using feedback from the call center, and the SMS platforms informing and influencing on listenership. So the ICTs that we're using, they were working in a combination, which helped to reach at least more masses than expected. And we also noticed that farmers are willing to pay for an agriculture solution or an ICT platform if it gives them more value than what was invested. I would give an example on the WhatsApp phones. Previously, when we were going in, there were not so many people who had WhatsApp phone. Now, I think I would recall having only one farmer. But as we're going towards the end, even currently, we have about people now texting me messages, 5 of them that have managed to acquire a smartphone, which to me, even though the number is very insignificant, but that just demonstrates that people are willing to invest in it, and then they remember to say, oh, they were telling us about these technologies, and then they say hi to you. So at least you know that they're willing to pay for an agriculture solution or a service or like WhatsApp if it gives them more value. And institutions can support farmers to act on the knowledge acquired by supporting the method of acquisition of agriculture technologies. So in my very previous slides, in my slides that I said, in my earlier slides, I talked about the law of other players whereby they were able to distribute inoculant, they were able to give inoculant on loan and credit. We see that was helping like farmers to act on the knowledge that they have heard about inoculant by aiding them in acquisition to access that technology, and that was through a loan. So in a way, NASFAM demonstrated that like one of the other players or institutions giving out inoculant as a loan or credit to member farmers, thereby aiding them in accessing inoculant. And also promotion and demonstration are necessary to enhance the uptake of both the technology and the ICTs. So we see that our demonstration of how to use the smartphones actually helped the farmer. Similarly, the demonstration on how to use inoculant also helped the farmer. So in essence, the ICTs that we had, I would echo on what Berhani said in his area presentation on the case studies, that the ICTs played a role of providing information that helped the farmers to ultimately adopt the use of inoculant They were able to get information on where to access inoculant. They were able to get information on how to use soybean inoculant and to know about things on how they can actually keep the inoculant in terms of storage. And of course, since we took the value chain approach, providing them also advisories on the other aspects, for instance, markets, which we also took a role in helping to link these farmers to those. So ICTs do have an impact in the scaling up of agriculture solutions, in this case, soybean inoculant.
My name is George Vididi. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Farm Radio Trust. And for this project, I was the project team leader. So I will be presenting on the power policy environment for this project. And why was it important for us in this project to focus on the policy environment? We were looking at issues of sustainability of the intervention beyond this research project, but also to support the framework to determine reach and scale. So from the policy aspect, I'm going to talk about the policy development process. Through this project, we looked at the role in which we can use the ICT to be part of the national agriculture policy. So as a project, but also as an organization, we worked with other actors to lobby for inclusion of ICT as a key component in the national agriculture policy so that it has a legal framework to guide all the interventions that have got to do with ICT. Beyond that, we worked with the Department of Agriculture Extension, who were spearheading the role of ICT now in the National Agriculture Extension Strategy. In that strategy, there is a strong articulation on the role of ICT, and we are moving forward even to lobby the department to develop an e-extension strategy that is going to give step-by-step outline on how best we can use the ICT for extension. Beyond that, we are looking at the policy in terms of coordination. When we were starting the project, we had one challenge where different actors were giving conflicting information to farmers. So to resolve that challenge, we established what we call National Agriculture Content Development Committee. This is a committee where you have the private actors, the researchers, the institution of higher learnings, the government coming together to develop content that will be used for different types of ICT platform to share the information to smallholder farmers. So in this coordination, we were looking at one, the quality assurance, but also standardization of quantity. And this National Agriculture Content Development Committee develops content for each agriculture season. In this case, under this project, we developed the content for 2018-2019 agriculture season. But also, as a project, we work towards institutionalization of the use of ICTs. We worked with the institutions of higher learning, our 5 universities, where we reviewed the curriculum in these institutions to include issues of ICT as key component for information delivery. But also as an organization, Farm Radio, we were adjunct faculty to the Department of Extension in the University of Agriculture and Natural Resources, where students will come to our organization to have hands-on experience on how they can use ICT for extension. Now, to make sure that this is more long-term, we developed a memorandum of understanding between our organization and the institution of Luana, for example, where we have a 5-year MOU where we're going to influence their curriculum, but also provide space for students to have internship, but also to have hands-on experience in as far as use of ICT is concerned. We also worked with the Ministry of Agriculture through the Department of Agriculture Extension Services to train their agriculture communication officers across the country on the role of ICT in extension delivery. So we have about 25 agriculture communication officers who were trained, and they're now using these experiences to share more information on the agriculture advisories. And we think by working with the government and the Institution for Higher Learning, we are institutionalizing the work of ICT beyond the project. And then the other part that we worked on is the public-private partnership. This is where now we're working with different actors so that they can pay for the services that we are doing, but also others can contribute content in whatever we're doing in the ICTs. For example, in the inoculant that we're working in Chinji under this project, we brought in private companies who are the developers or the producers of the inoculant, who are contributing to the content, but also they are subsidizing some of the cost that we are providing under the SMS push, but also the call center. We have plans with the Department of Agriculture Extension to establish a radio which is going to be focusing on agriculture, and this radio station is going to be managed under the public-private partnership, where, for example, in terms of management, the farm radio is going to take the lead, but the government is going to provide the quality assurance in terms of content, but also even seconding some members of staff to be part and parcel of running this radio station. Also, as part of the advocacy in the project, we are advocating with the government through the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Finance to remove the duty in the ICT equipment that are used for ICT-based extension. My colleague, when she was presenting, she raised an issue of high cost of buying the radio. The radio in itself, they're not expensive, but it is the duty that is being placed placed on this radio that makes the gadget more expensive. So we want to lobby with the government to remove the duty on these ICT so that more farmers are able to access the radio and they can also access more information on the same. But also, like I said, we want to work with the Department for Agriculture Extension to develop an e-extension strategy that is going to bring greater coordination on the use of ICT. And then lastly, we would want to work with the Malawi Forum for Agriculture Extension and actors so that we can bring standardization in the approaches for extension and methods. The whole idea is we would want that farmers must be protected as they are accessing information. They must not be given things that are not evidence-based. So to control that, we want to work towards standardization of the ICT approach, and we are working with the department and other actors in the extension to make sure that that direction is fulfilled in the short time possible. Now, what are the key lessons that we have learned from the environment, from the policy environment? One, to us, is the shift from the project approach to the formal or institutionalized system. The reason why, as a project, we are working with the government, working with the institutions of higher learning, we don't want to approach this from the project perspective, but how best can we institutionalize this, and even beyond the project, these things must continue. This is why we work with the government, we work with the institution of higher learning, even in the curriculum, so that this is being done in a long-term perspective. The other lesson that we have learned over time is the leadership in driving the ICT agenda. Farm Radio Trust as an organization, we positioned ourselves to take leadership in the use of ICT in the agriculture sector. So we are in the forefront in advocating this agenda. This is why in the National Agriculture Content Development Committee, we are the chair of that platform. From the Civil Society Organization Network, we sit in the board to lobby for the greater use of ICT, but also in the Malawi Forum for Agriculture Advisories, we are in the technical team and we are chairing that platform so that we also provide technical leadership. So we have learned that over a period of time, we need greater leadership to drive the use of ICT agenda so that this can be taken to a greater scale. And then finally, we have also learned that we need to garner support for the ICT agenda and pathways through policy actors. Whatever we're doing as Farm Radio, we have learned that we need to have government on board. This is why we have worked very, very closely with the Department of Agriculture Extension so that they are seen also to bring these lessons and to bring these innovations into the top management of the ministry so that these things can be sustained. A few weeks ago, we had a meeting where we were sharing the same experiences on using ICT for extension. And one of the key resolutions that were made in that meeting was that we need to have an interface with the top management in the ministry so that they can have a buy-in in the use of ICT. So the Department of Agriculture Extension is providing leadership, and this is why we say having the support of the policy actors in driving this agenda is more impactful and also brings sustainability to the work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you, George. I'm Bernard again. This time I'll be discussing the broader ICT for Scale conceptual framework. So using the findings from the different research components that we just described, one of the main objectives of this research was to develop an ICT for Scale framework that could guide development practitioners in their use of ICTs for the scaling of agricultural innovations. Now, in view of the complexity and diversity of contexts within which scaling initiatives take place, such a framework could obviously not be fully prescriptive. In fact, we'd like to look at this framework as some sort of theory of change linking ICTs to achieving impact at scale. So in this section, we'll be looking at the selection of components of this ICT for Scale framework. Again, I'd like to reiterate that some of these components will be described in more details in upcoming webinars. The first point that needs to be highlighted when discussing this ICT for Scale framework is to recognize that a number of frameworks have already been proposed by development practitioners, research institutions, funders to guide the process of scaling. This means that the any ICT for Scale framework should in fact be viewed as some particular case of an existing scaling framework. Here, we've just selected a few components taken from these broader scaling frameworks, which we'll discuss over the next few slides. The idea then is to examine the potential role played by ICTs in implementing these various components and what are the key issues to consider. Let's start with this idea of visioning, which here includes both the idea of assessing scalability and responsible scaling. A number of tools guidelines have been proposed to help us assess the scalability of an agricultural innovation, such as, for example, looking at the characteristic of the innovation being scaled, the enabling or hindering qualities of the broader policy institutional environment, the capacity of the organization implementing the scaling, and so on. These various tools are still of immediate relevance to an ICT for Scale initiative and should be used accordingly. Furthermore, while assessing scalability focuses on whether or not an agricultural innovation has the potential to be scaled and under what conditions, the notion of responsible scaling refers to whether or not an agricultural innovation should be scaled, and if so, what would be the optimal scale. Of particular importance is to try to anticipate the potential positive or negative social and environmental impact of scaling, recognizing that findings observed at the piloting stage may not necessarily be transferable at larger scales. When thinking of potential impacts, we're referring to both the impact of the innovation being scaled, but also of the scaling process itself. Some issues of particular relevance for an ICT for scale projects are, first, the risk of exacerbating the digital divide. In effect, by using ICTs to scaling, are we running the risk of further excluding the most marginalized and vulnerable populations? ICTs also provide an opportunity to gather quality data from smallholder farmers, which could be very useful for agricultural extension and advisory services. But this also means that large amounts of personal data could be collected, highlighting the need to put in place responsible data handling procedures that will protect the end users. We also need to remember that technology is not neutral. When bringing different actors, we need to recognize that different interests are at stake. On a more practical note, ICTs can also amplify demands, let's say for seeds or other products that the supply systems cannot meet. If we are successful promoting the production of a given crop, what may be the impact on market prices and so on? So these are all part of reflection that needs to take place in terms of visioning what would be the impact of the scaling process and the intervention that we're scaling up. Now, it is important to highlight that in the various projects that we've looked at during this research initiative, very few had explicitly gone through such a visionist exercise. Now, perhaps these discussions have indeed taken place, but in a non-formal way. Now, with the recent development of tools to facilitate this process, we're expecting this visionist component to become a more integral part of scaling initiatives. Now, the second component of the scaling framework that we could look at is the scaling strategy itself. Here we'll focus on two elements of the scaling strategy that we think are particularly relevant in the context of an ICT-enabled scaling initiatives. Now, in both cases, we're looking at scaling not only in terms of pushing an innovation to a large number of people, but in terms of the systems change needed in order for an innovation to have a sustainable impact in a given context. One of the challenges of scaling is the difficulty to disseminate or push an agricultural innovation that has been tested and validated in a piloting phase towards people living in a very different context and so on. In such context, one way to look at scaling strategy in an ICT for Scale initiative is to assess ways by which ICTs can contribute to facilitating changes in the system. Here, the field of ICT for Ag can provide a useful framework to categorize the different types of intervention and how they can assist addressing some of the challenges facing agricultural systems. Now, in the various scaling approaches used in the project we examined, most could be categorized as addressing some particular agricultural challenges described here on this slide. This becomes a useful way to think about ICT-enabled strategies to scale up. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details on that slide here, but just to highlight here that the different kind of system change related to agriculture that could be tackled through ICTs. And in one of the upcoming webinars that we're planning to do, we'd like to go into more detail on some of the strategy that can be used in the context of an ICT for Scale initiative. The other component we wanted to highlight under the strategies for ICT for Scale initiative is the role of communication. This is perhaps one of the most interesting findings of this research initiatives. As highlighted in the ICT4D literature, ICTs is not only about one-way dissemination, but also about multi-way communication. This idea of communication, which includes concepts such as interactivity, participation, dialogue, networks, is in our view a key component of any scaling process aiming at facilitating systemic changes needed to support the uptake of or integration of a novel practice. It is our impression that existing scaling frameworks do not employ this component to its full potential. Now, just for example, we can look at ICTs as potentially strengthening farmers' social and interpersonal networks, which can contribute to the local innovative capacity. ICTs can facilitate interactivity and dialogue between farmers and other stakeholders in the system. And perhaps more importantly, ICTs can contribute to social and behavior change communication strategy that will influence social norms and strengthen scaling process. So we've recognized that as part of this communication strategy that the use of multiple communication channels and strategies seems to be more effective. Now, one could argue that better communication and ensuring that there's some dialogue, some interactivity taking place within the different system could even play a role in mitigating risk associated with the scaling by having this ongoing dialogue and discussion around the impact of scaling. Of course, the use of ICTs will not magically lead to positive changes, and we need to be careful in the way this is implemented. But we think that this idea of focusing or putting some emphasis on communication in the context of scaling should be explored further. Now, the other component of our framework, and we've highlighted the fact that we wanted to explicitly look at gender-related issues, has been discussed in the context of the meta review and the intervention research and also the case studies. First, there is a clear issue about the lower access and use of ICTs by women that has been observed across the different projects. Now, many of the projects could be viewed in a way as gender responsive in the fact that they've addressed these issues by improving women's access to ICTs, either by providing smartphones or providing radio set to different listener groups and so on. They also facilitated their participation in the interactivity by increasing their capacity and also by building capacity of women in using ICTs and building their confidence in, let's say, calling the radio or participating on like ICT platforms and so on. There's also some work that's been done to making sure that the content that was discussed on these different ICT platforms was relevant to women and so on. So these initiatives, in a way, add some positive impact in the sense that they led to increased knowledge, adoption of promoted practices, and some increased sense of self-confidence. However, it is important to highlight that most projects, in a way, do not attempt to tackle the social cultural norms underlying gender inequality and women's disempowerment. So most of the projects were not really gender transformative per se. Not to say that every project needs to be gender transformative, but we need to look into that idea here that if we want to tackle some of the more like structural or social cultural norms that are kind of underlying the gender inequalities, that there might be a role played by ICTs in that sense. But again, we need to be careful in how this is handled. But what we've seen is that when women were given the opportunity to access and use ICTs, they were using it and they saw that as something that could be positive. So there's some thinking to be done on that front. The other component we've decided to put some focus on in this context here is this idea of enabling environment and linking that to the broader issue of sustainability. One thing we've observed across the different projects is that sustainability was a challenge across most projects. Many of these projects were in fact relatively short-term projects, which always create some issues related to the ability to sustain the impact of their activities. Now, in the field of scaling, discussions around sustainability often highlight the fact that it can be done either through markets or governments, in the sense that these are the kind of type of institution, the structure that could support both this idea of scaling, reaching more people, and in a sustainable way. Now, one way to look at the government role is that innovation that are being scaled need to be integrated within existing public institution and infrastructure to garner political agency and support. We've seen that a little bit in the context of the intervention research on soybean inoculants, where the scaling of inoculants was viewed as an important activity that the Ministry of Agriculture wanted to put in place in Malawi. The other role of government is maybe more around creating policies and an enabling environment that could assist in the process of using ICTs. And we've seen again in George's presentation about the role played in trying to incorporate ICTs in the extension strategy, in the natural agricultural policy, and so on, to see addressing issues about low ICT access related to power, connectivity, availability, and affordability, and so on. So by working more broadly around agricultural extension services, then this can play a role in facilitating system change that could facilitate the scaling of some of these innovations. Of course, ICT, and this is documented in the ICT4D literature also, in terms of the potential role in enabling market-based approaches by, let's say, among other things, reducing transaction costs and strengthening the market linkages and so on. And also there are different models through the different projects we've looked at, different kind of multi-stakeholder partnership, public-private partnership that have been investigated and examined in terms of building support and sustaining the scaling process through, for example, interactive radio platforms and different models that are still being tested. But at this point in time, there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done and some thinking around this issue of sustainability and providing ways to ensure that the impact are both at scale but sustainable. Finally, the last point last component that we wanted to focus on was this monitoring and evaluation and learning component. Like most projects that we've looked at focus on what we would call the usual development indicators, like for example, changes in knowledge, attitude, and practices, and so on. And also look at the number of people maybe that have been reached through the intervention and so on. Now, there are a number of challenges just on that front in terms of the methodology, in terms of working at larger scale over large geographical areas and so on, in terms of finding ways to measure the impact of a given initiative. But maybe more importantly is this idea that monitoring and evaluation in the context of scaling initiatives should also look at the process of scaling itself. So the scaling process itself needs to be tackled, and there's some elements here that we need to take in place. And part of it is because scaling takes place in a complex system, and in a way, the dynamic process that we observe are like non-linear. So what it means is that what we've observed at the piloting stages, when we were doing the proof of concept and so on, some of these cannot just be transferred to larger scales. At some point, we need to find ways to measure, assess the impact at scale as we go from the piloting stage, let's say, to larger scales and so on. So this requires more flexible, iterative, adaptive monitoring, evaluation, and learning approaches. And there's quite a number of challenges associated with that. Also, if we're looking at the scaling process as including an element of systemic changes, well then the whole debate around attribution versus contribution of our activities becomes a little bit maybe not as relevant. At some point, we need to find ways to try to assess these scaling processes in a more innovative way. So I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done on that front. As we look at different projects, they kind of take a more traditional way of monitoring and evaluation, but it is important that we also look at the scaling process itself. And then along those lines, try to think about indicators that would be specific to ICT for Scale initiative, and particularly the communication element of it. How do we measure that impact? How do we capture some of these changes? So these, of course, there are other components that we could look into in more details in this framework, and this is kind of an overview that we've given about this ICT for Scale framework. As we have said before, we'd like to go a bit deeper in some of these components in upcoming webinars, where we will also invite other practitioners, other NGOs, other groups that have been involved in these issues to share their experiences. So moving forward, we can see that this research in a way confirms that there is potential of ICTs to contribute to enhancing a scaling process, definitely. But we also see that for vulnerable smallholder farmers, especially women, there remain significant barriers around access and use of ICTs. So even though there's quite a bit of hype around the use of ICTs in contributing to achieving, for example, the SDGs, in practice, in the field, we see that there's a lot of issues around access and use of ICTs that may limit this potential. So there's also important challenges remaining around the development of sustainable business models, and also in terms of monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategies. And we hope that we can continue that conversation, in other words, to refine and strengthen our understanding of this process and how it could be improved. So, of course, there's more research to be done on applying the ICT for Scale framework. And we hope that with this webinar, we've initiated a discussion around these topics. And through the learning platform, which hope you'll be interested to participate, we can learn from each other and increase our understanding of the use of ICT in scaling, and also find out more ways to address some of the barriers that we're facing. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to this webinar.
Hi, everyone. This is Mark at Farm Radio International. We are going to look through some of the questions that were asked during the webinar, live as well as online. And hopefully we can give some answers to those questions. We weren't able to get to all those questions, so we are going to answer some of them for the first time here. The first one is from Jennifer, and actually several others in the room had the same question. So they said, what is meant by masculine content? And what is the difference between that and feminine content? So they're trying to really understand what you meant when you were talking about masculine content.
Thank you, Mark. This is Brahani. By masculine content, it means that the content is prepared, keeping in mind that the farmer is a man, not keeping in mind that the farmer is a woman. In some languages, for example, the word you, when you say you, the way you address you to a man and the way you address to you to a woman is different. You have different vocabulary in some languages. So when that you refers to a man instead of a woman. And also from the webinar, the online participants, Sophia indicated an interesting observation. It also relates to women's activities. I mean, the women's farming activities are different from men's farming activities. So the content focuses primarily to the farming activities that are done by men, not women. Other important consideration is that when the content is disseminated, that requires some voice. If it's only done by men, it makes a difference. There would be a perception that, or an understanding that it's directed to what is men farmers, not women farmers. So bringing women to the fora, if it's a radio talk show, making them participate in that talk show, and then directly address women farmers, and directly address the farming activities that are primarily done by women in that area. And also when manuals are prepared, written manuals are prepared, make sure that the you refers to both genders. Thank you.
Thanks, Berhani. And I'll just add, I think Sophia's comment is right on the head there. So she's really addressing the idea of participation, I think, looking at how important it is to make sure that the content, whether it's on radio or on SMS or interactive voice response, is really speaking to the audience that's really the target audience. And in many cases, this can be very gendered and really only speaking to men. We know that when women, for example, participate in radio programs, those are going to be much more successful at appealing to women, appealing to their specific needs and specific experiences, and hopefully have a much kind of more loyal fan base, I guess, when it comes to radio or TV, but also have a better outcome as well with different audiences. I'm going to move on. There was another question. Again, this was a common question. I think it was Jennifer that brought this forward. She says, what are some examples of hyper-local, evidence-based agricultural practices? And I think we'll dive a little bit into the idea of the hyper-local with this question. Brani, go ahead.
So the hyper-local evidence-based agriculture needs to be guided by the agroecological zoning of that area instead of the geographic or the administrative boundaries of an area. For example, an administrative boundary could be a district or a county or a sub-county. So if the content is disseminated, the agricultural practice, especially the ones that are informed by weather and soil type, if it's disseminated, as is the practice in many instances, by administrative boundaries such as district, that's not going to be useful to the farmers. What is useful to the farmers is a content that is localized to the local agroecological zoning and to specific, which is informed by specific weather forecasters for that for that area. Also, language is an important component. It's just the content needs to be prepared in the local language that is understood by the farmers. So there are challenges here in terms of the language, because some of the scientific language that is used there may not be words that would adequately describe that scientific word. So it's important to work with elders or people who have indigenous knowledge of the way farming practices are communicated in that area, so that it's packaged in a way that is understandable. Not only just the language, translating it to language is not adequate. It should be translated to a local language in a way that adequately describes the practice using indigenous knowledge. So I also want to mention that the generation of hyper-local evidence-based agricultural practice is expensive. It's not cheap. You need the human resource infrastructure to be able to do that. So there are examples from the case study where the role of localizing that content, localizing content was devolved to, for example, district level in Uganda for the Chai project. But they need to be trained. The district level production officers or agriculture officers need to be trained on how to interpret weather information, on how to interpret agricultural advisories in a way so that they can package it in a way that is suitable for their area. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And I think we have quite a few questions that are really around that topic, so I think we'll stick on this for a couple minutes. Charles Rice writes, how do you ensure that content is locally relevant if done centrally? And we basically had the same question from Frank Schneider at Global Affairs Canada. So how do you ensure the standardization of content while keeping it as local as possible? So maybe I can start on this one. I think this is a real challenge. So we really have to walk like a tightrope in terms of looking at making sure that content is standardized and correct, accurate in terms of knowledge partners, reviewing the content and making sure that it's as vetted as possible, but making sure that we're able to stick with the idea of participation and interactivity. So, you can very easily, when it comes to radio, produce something very centrally, like in a capital city somewhere, and then kind of send it out to radio stations to put on the air. But what you lose there is you lose that dynamism of the content when you have, for example, live broadcasts with call-ins and those types of things. So there's really, you have to be somewhere in the middle where you're producing content that has been vetted, but also giving room for what I like to refer to as like storytellers, people that work at radio stations or work at television studios, wherever, that are really kind of localizing this content for the audience. So making sure that it's interesting and entertaining while still making sure that the content is following the standards that the knowledge partners have laid out. I think Lucy from CABI went into a little bit about what you just said, actually, Brahani. She says, content development processes are long and costly, especially when a project wants to align content with local priorities and with established partnerships. Can we then consider this as a barrier to ICTs in agriculture? And I think you did answer that question, but is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it could be a barrier, a major significant barrier, and adequate budget, and in terms of time, adequate time need to be budgeted for the content development process, because what is available um, may not be adequate. And also, Lucy mentions about establishing partnerships. Yes, the establishing partnerships at national level and also all the way down to the lowest government administrative unit needs to be established. That by itself also is time consuming. It must be done, but it's time consuming, and that is also an important point. Thank you.
Great. We have an interesting comment / question from Ricardo Del Castello. He says, communicating with rural audiences in most African countries can be a daunting task if we consider the numerous local languages and high illiteracy rates. Rural radio has been quite active in this field for the last 40 years and have come up with innovative ways to integrate radio and ICTs to overcome these barriers. He makes specific reference to West Africa rural community radios that have offered a number of interesting approaches and examples. And he's wondering if the research has looked specifically into West Africa to see if there's any initiatives that have had what he's calling sort of common practices or best practices in this area. Berhani, is there anything that came out in terms of West Africa rural radio?
I don't think that came out well, but the use of community radio have been practiced by some of the cases, and they provide an important platform for communication. And the community radios could be, these are very basic. I mean, in Uganda also, there are community radios. So the projects there have been using the community radios especially for communicating market information, local market information. But apart from that, it didn't come out strongly.
I can speak a little bit to, it's not shown empirically in the research, but some of our experience at Farm Radio International. Obviously, we work with almost 900 radio stations across Africa, so we have quite a bit of experience with West African radio versus other localities, and certainly we do notice that in West Africa that they've done a lot of innovation on culturally relevant types of shows, a lot around game shows, a lot around things like cooking shows to really show people how to grow or how to cook new crops that might be coming up. So it's kind of interesting, entertaining examples, I think, have been coming out of those contexts. And I think another thing worthy of note is, people will often use community radio as kind of a catch-all. And we did want to highlight that often public radio and private radio stations actually play a very large role, as well as community radio, obviously, and religious radio. So making sure that we're clear that there's actually many different types of radio stations that can be part of this picture. Related to that, Charles Rice jumped in and asked, is there recent data on the number of people in Africa who use radio to get news and information? I'll let you go first, Berhani.
I don't have the statistics on the number of people in Africa who get news from radio, but there was a research which was done in Uganda, which could be a good example. So we did a household survey in 2012 about the preferences of farmers, smallholder farmers, on communication channels. And at that time, 97% of the respondents said that they trust radio, they use radio, compared to other channels. It was only 3% who said mobile phones, and the reason that they provided was There were spam messages that they receive on mobile phones, and the spam messages, sometimes they would ask them, if you click this, you would win so much money, and then they do that, and a certain amount of money is taken away from the credits that they have, and this was extremely annoying for the farmers. So this has changed over the years. So the most recent follow-up, so we've been doing like almost every year the survey for the same area. So the most recent figures show that about over 60% preferred radio, and still the mobile phone preference is like a little under 40%. So the preference of radio is still high. Some of the qualitative studies that we did, in their own words, they say if it's in the waves, it must be trustworthy. So there is a very high level of trust associated with radio as a channel. But also, who is on the radio is also important. Not only the channel itself, but who is on the radio, who is talking. If it is someone that they trust, who is on the radio, also makes a huge difference. But overall, there is a high level of trust on radio, and maybe in terms of the radio ownership, what it's like. Mark may say more on that.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more generally. I think the data is not always there, but we know from the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, who used to publish this data regularly, that it was always up there in terms of the top sources of information, news or agricultural information. From our own surveys at Farm Radio International, we've come to similar conclusions. We're looking anywhere from 60% to over 90% of people having access to radios. Not necessarily ownership, because ownership can be limiting. We're looking at people that access radios either at neighbors' houses or in listener groups. Sometimes they'll even listen at marketplaces and things like that. So certainly access is much higher than ownership. In our own surveys, we see, yes, it's pretty high in terms of preference as well. We're seeing people, often they're reporting something like extension, like traditional face-to-face extension, as one of their most preferred ways, at least to get agricultural information. But we know practically that can be a challenge for people to get access to a face-to-face demonstration with an extension worker. So even though that might be number one in many cases, we know that in most cases it's unrealistic to expect traditional extension to reach out to everyone. So radio might be number two, but it really ends up being almost the top for many people. Which kind of leads us into the next question. Paul Hagerman from Canadian Food Grains Bank says, very interesting to hear how this project is encouraging the government of Malawi to use more ICTs in extension. From my understanding, ICTs can be cheaper than other extension tools and still effective. A good solution to underfunded and understaffed extension services in many countries. What potential do you see for other African governments to use more ICTs in their own extension systems? And are Farm Radio International and Farm Radio Trust, as well as IDRC, promoting this in other countries?
So I'm going to respond to this from Farm Radio Trust perspective, that one of the things that we have done as an organization is to participate in the international conferences where we share the role of ICT. We were in the HRF conference in Ghana where we made this presentation, but also we attended the ICT4D conference in Uganda. So we want to take advantage of these different platforms where we can share the lessons that we have had in the role of ICT in agriculture extension.
Many African countries and other countries in the least developed and medium to middle income countries as well are using ICTs for supporting their extension systems, and many countries are developing or already have developed e-extension or e-agriculture strategies. Multilateral organizations such as FAO also have their own e-agriculture or e-extension systems. So all this is going to lead to the increased use of ICTs for expanding extension systems. So the question was, I mean, the comment was related to Malawi. Definitely in Malawi, the extension department also have introduced the use of ICT as one of the main pillars of their extension delivery system. As is in Ethiopia also, among the multiple pillars of the extension system, the use of ICT is also indicated as one of the major pillars for the delivery of effective extension system. So in terms of having ICTs, integrating ICTs for improving extension is there. The problem, I think, that is still there, that did not have a good answer or approach, is in terms of how do you fund it, and who pays for such services? Is it a farmer? Is it a government? What business model is really sustainable for supporting the use of ICTs for improving extension? Thank you.
Thank you. I think our colleagues from Farm Radio Trust in Malawi will also probably get into some of the answers behind this question as well. I think if I had to give an answer to this as well, I think it's a long-term process, and I think a lot of countries are just at the beginning of this process, so they might have had policies in place in the past, but maybe there wasn't a lot happening in terms of actually making them operational. So we're seeing Ghana start to make major moves in this area. But the situation in Malawi, I know more personally through Farm Radio Trust, this has been a work in progress for the past decade of Farm Radio Trust and other organizations in Malawi really pushing this with the government. So it requires some capacity building with government agencies and really making sure that they are comfortable with the things that are being proposed. And a lot of credit goes to Farm Radio Trust for some of their advocacy work on that and sticking with it for literally a decade to make sure that this starts to happen in an organized way. So.
Then Lucy from Kabi also wanted to know and understand the content development processes. It looks like from her perspective, this is a long process, but also is costly. So I would want to share the experiences from Malawi, the way we developed the National Agriculture Content Development Committee. That in this committee, members, they contribute. So it's not a project that is contributing, but different organizations, the government, the private sector, and the non-state actors, they contribute to the meetings. In that way, we think the interventions are going to be sustainable. But also, once we have developed the content at the national level, then we take the content to the districts so that we want to see whether the content that's been generated at the national level is relevant to the local needs. So we make sure that at the national level is evidence-based, but at the district level, it is responding to the needs of the actors in that district. For example, when we were doing the project in Nchinji, we did bring together the actors from Nchinji district who came in to validate the content that was developed. So we make sure that the content has got input from the farmers, but also it has got input from the different policy actors and researchers. Christopher Spark raised the question during the discussion, why are we saying the ICTs can? Why not just be straightforward? I think to me it's just a semantic. We are convinced by the end of this research that indeed the use of ICT is able and has capacity to increase adoption of agriculture technology. So it's not something that is still being debated. I think the research has brought that evidence that ICT really does increase the uptake of technology. Thank you.
So I'll proceed to answer some of the questions that were on the webinar chat. So Mwendo has a question, says, share the impact of different combinations of information sources on farmers' soya productivity. So that the combinations are extension worker and radio, extension worker and mobile phone, and extension worker and radio and mobile phone. So I'll start with the first one, which is extension worker plus radio. I'll just give a response in like combination of ICTs and the extension worker because I feel like they're almost related. In a way is that if the farmer has no access to the ICT platform, then they can use the physical contact with the extension workers in their locality, so they may get advisories on be it on the production, on sources of information, where they can get inoculant and whatnot. Similarly, with the radio programs, then that will actually also give them that very same information. In essence, all these platforms are providing information that influences the farmer to uptake the technology that we're talking about. So it's like access to information on utilization, on demonstration, which can be done by extension worker physically, which is actually good. They actually see what is happening, which may not be covered in radio or a mobile phone. But in terms of in the presence that the farmers, the extension workers are not there, then they can call, which is convenient for them. It's within their reach. It's just a phone call away. They can call using the mobile phones to get advisories and whatnot. And so it tends to be convenient for the farmer for information that is very quick and fast. Like, where can I get this? Or demonstration can also be done, but it's through the audio, which of course we cannot dispute the importance of the physical aspect of it, that people will understand more when they see that. But so in essence, that's how these are more or less like linked. So you need both the radio, the mobile phones, and the extension worker. So they all both have an impact in a way that they're providing information to the farmer that will help them adopt use of soybean inoculant. And Ricardo Ramirez asks, is Malawi free of GMO soy? And if not, how did this affect the campaign? So we don't have GMO soy in Malawi. We have had trials for BT cotton. That's just at that level. Just trials for BT cotton, but not soybean. So we are free of GMO soy. And Charles Rice has asked the question, what is the penetration of smartphones among farmers in Malawi? With the recent data that we have about smartphones penetration among the farmers is around 30%. But this just puts like all the farmers in bracket, be it they're urban farmers or rural farmers or urban farmers. So smartphones are at 30%. All right. So Jennifer has a question. I would also be interested in knowing more about any findings related to two-way use of ICTs, where clients or users are sharing information and knowledge back to providers using ICTs, agency-related improvements. So yes, actually, that was what has been actually happening in the implementation of the intervention research. Our methods are more like two-way. In a way, with the SMS pool or the call center, they provide that type of two-way communication, whereby from the producers and from the end of extension providers with the producers of inoculant, and then informing farmers on that. I would give a typical example. When we had a lot of farmers asking where to get inoculant, we had to interact with the producer to say, where is the inoculant? So with that feedback we got, we gave it back on the radio and on the call center to provide farmers with those advisories. So that's more about how related they are. More like you respond to the issues as need arises, because it allows a two-way communication. So, and there's Rex Chapota, which says, did you probe during intervention research the benefits accruing to private sector, e.g. agro dealers or the inoculant suppliers, and how ready they are to invest in the scale-up process since they benefited? Yes, we did that. Most of them did acknowledge that there's been a lot of demand on soybean inoculant, and they were attributing it to the campaign that that we were doing. And also for some of them, they were able to also help in paying some of the services, for instance, SMS messages and whatnot, to actually help farmers get the information that they need. And also at the same time, they also did on their own some other campaigns using some radio on promoting their technologies, more like jingles and whatnot. During the season, as we're approaching towards the end, they already do their own promotions. So already they are already there to actually implement what they are actually, to actually promote their products, which can actually help them in the scaling up process of soybean inoculant. So another question is from Rex Chapota. Was the price of the technology to be scaled a factor in the intervention research? Was this analyzed in view of income levels of those that access the inoculant? Yes, this was done. Before we actually picked soybean inoculant, we had to go through what we call the research council to actually analyze the technologies that we're actually promoting. Like you might have noticed in my earlier presentation, why soybean inoculant is because it's something that farmers can actually afford. So yes, it was considered, because it will make no sense to promote a technology that cannot be afforded by the majority of the farmers. Then the scale up would be such a challenge. So yes, it was actually considered. So these are some of the questions that we had that were not responded earlier on. Thank you.
Thanks, Alubi. I just wanted to thank the International Development Research Center for funding this research, as well as the different researchers that engage with us on this piece of work, both in our research team, but also the organizations that took time out of their busy days to answer all of our questions. I also want to thank all the attendees that came to the live event, but also anyone that's listening to this video right now. Stay tuned for more webinars focused on ICT for scale in the future, and we hope to see you soon.